I saw Joan Roach, I forget where you're from, maybe Seattle, saying you have a headache. I mean, I think any of us who stayed up, and I think many, probably all of us on this call, I'm not sure I'd call it a debate. I'm not going to use words that were used on CNN, but it was a debacle. It was a debasement of this country. But at 10:39, our guest, and we couldn't have a timelier guest, tweeted, "Never in the history of American politics has a president before Trump refused to accept the results of election before votes were even counted." He did more than that. I mean, he allied himself with white supremacist groups. There was no dog whistle. It was like a cow whistle, if that's possible. And he basically menaced this country and those who believe voting is not a partisan act when he said this isn't going to, he predicted, didn't he, Ari? I mean, he predicted, he didn't guess or speculate, this is not going to end well. So I think all of us who believe in voting rights as part of the frayed democracy have a lot to learn from Ari today. And I'm sure you and your own communities have been working. It is, we were talking to Ari before this call. It is extraordinary. I think it was 2016 was the first election held without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. And you have had a Republican Party devoted to suppression and voting rights abuses. And we face that now with a president who legitimizes that. Let me just say a few words about Ari. He also told us he's been talking to a lot of sports teams in the last weeks, which I think is interesting, as sports is part of our politics and culture, as you know from Dave Zirin's work. Ari was, as so many committed, principled, extraordinary journalists, he was a Nation intern. And then I asked him to stay on, and he wrote hundreds of important pieces as a senior contributing writer. He's now a correspondent senior reporter at Mother Jones, and he's gone on to establish himself as a vital, authoritative voice on voting rights. We were talking earlier, I think this was not a beat years ago. It's become a beat at major papers, one or two people assigned to it, which is a measure of how contested voting rights remain, as Eric Foner reminded us in his call. He wrote a book called Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. I suggested to everyone it was 2015. And then, of course, he paid attention to what's happened to the Voting Rights Act of '65. And Give Us the Ballot told that story for the first time. It was a groundbreaking narrative history. And he charted the transformation of American democracy under the Voting Rights Act and the counter-revolution that we're living through. It received many awards. His stories have also appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone. I was always unhappy when they appeared in Rolling Stone. And Guardian, frequent guest on Chris Hayes' show on MSNBC and others. He also, and this is relevant for our questions today, I think, wrote a book, Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. He wrote a lot about Howard Dean. I'm sure many of you remember Howard Dean and his fight to remake the Democratic Party as a 50-state party, which is something we're seeing now with the fight, as Joan Walsh writes so well about, to take back state legislatures and the importance of that. He did a very good piece on Mark Penn, Hillary Clinton's advisor many years ago, and the intersection of money and politics. So I'm delighted to have Ari here. He's been a longtime friend and a longtime friend of the magazine. And I know he'll talk to us a little bit about the history of the Voting Rights Act and what we can do in these last days more concretely. But there's an enormous amount to talk about. And Ari, I'm very grateful to you for being here. Thank you.
Hey, Katrina. Good to see you virtually. And it's great to be back with all of my former Nation comrades. I spent many years working for the magazine and have many great memories. And Katrina, I just want to thank you for giving me my start in journalism and always encouraging me to follow my passions when it came to my reporting. And when I wanted to do voting rights as a beat, which nobody had really done, you really allowed me to embrace it and gave me the space to write my book and gave me the space to talk about it in all sorts of ways. So I just really want to thank you. And as you mentioned, you're always part of the Nation family, no matter where you go, where around the world you go, you're always part of the family. So there's a lot to talk about. I just want to give a little bit of history, modern history. You could go back a long way when you talk about voting rights, but just a little bit of a modern history, and then talk about where we are today, because it's a really unprecedented situation we find ourselves 34 days before the election. So I think it's really important for people to understand voter suppression began before Trump. Obviously, it goes back a long time. But in the last decade, the Republican Party has been committed to making it harder to vote before Trump got in office. Trump has accelerated what they're doing, but he didn't originate with it. So I first started paying attention to voting rights issues, which I honestly hadn't thought about for most of my life, after the 2010 election, when all of these key states flipped from blue to red, in Ohio and Florida and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. They're all controlled by Republicans. And the first thing they did was start introducing laws to make it harder to vote. Things like strict voter ID laws and cutbacks to early voting and closing polling places and purging the voting rolls. This is all stuff that I think we know about now, but was very unknown at the time. We had maybe seen one or two of states do things like that, but we had never seen so many states introduce these restrictions on voting in such a short period of time. And it clearly seemed to me an attempt to try to nullify the election of the first Black president and create an electorate that was older, whiter, more conservative, as opposed to younger, more diverse, and more progressive. So I started covering it then, as you say, first for Rolling Stone and then as a full-time beat for The Nation. And then what happened is, after the 2012 election, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Voting Rights Act. And they heard a challenge to the most important part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which said that those states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. That meant that it was a lot easier for those states that had historically discriminated to do so again now. And so after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, a decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts, who I always think is funny when someone calls him this great liberal, because this is the guy that gutted the Voting Rights Act. And of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously dissented in that case and said, you don't throw out your umbrella because you're not getting wet one day, that it's still going to rain. And that's exactly what we saw with voter suppression, that, for example, discriminatory laws like in Texas, where you could vote with a gun permit but not a student ID, were allowed to go into effect. The insane 6-hour lines we saw in Georgia during the primaries, where people were still voting at 12:30 p.m. at night. That was a consequence of Georgia closing over 200 polling places and 80 more during the primaries. So you had a situation where in white neighborhoods, the average wait time was 6 minutes. And in Black neighborhoods, the average wait time was 51 minutes. I mean, just an extraordinary disparity in terms of the experiences people have voting based on their race and where they live. And so I think the pandemic has really crystallized the reality of voter suppression right now, I think because of two reasons. Number one, it's just a lot harder to vote in a pandemic. That people are confused about how to vote. States were not prepared for this level of mail voting. Nobody thought in January of 2020 that we would have such a high level of mail voting that we're going to have now. So states were not prepared for it. States could not open enough polling places even if they wanted to because of the pandemic. So there are real challenges, real concrete challenges to running elections because of the pandemic. But then you, of course, have a president that's weaponizing every aspect of voting and taking this to a level I've never seen. I mean, there were efforts to restrict voting rights under George W. Bush, but he didn't spread falsehoods about voting every single day like Donald Trump is doing. We've never had a president, as you say, that's refused to basically commit to a peaceful transfer of power, that has essentially said he's counting on the Supreme Court to decide the election for him. That's why they're trying to rush Amy Coney Barrett. Apparently 5 justices on the Supreme Court's not enough for him. He now needs a 6th one because clearly he doesn't believe he can count on John Roberts to hand him the election like the Supreme Court did in the 2000 election in Florida. And so, I mean, there's just so much happening now from a voting perspective. And one thing I think is really important to note, 1.5 million people have already voted. And we've never seen those kind of numbers so early. And every single day I check the statistics, hundreds of thousands of new people are voting every single day. So, I mean, it'll probably go over 2 million people by tomorrow. So by the time we reach quote unquote election day, tens of millions of people are going to have voted. And I mean, the advice that I would just give everyone, and I know we're going to get more into this in the chat, but the advice I would just give everyone, and Vice President Biden said this tonight, is just make a plan to vote now, because there are inevitably going to be issues in this election. There's either going to be issues because states are struggling to run elections because of the pandemic, or because Trump and the Republicans are intentionally making it harder to vote. And those two trends are intersecting right now. So if you decide to vote by mail, do it early, right? because then you can try to offset the post office. If there's a problem with your ballot, like in New York, where all these people are getting ballots with the wrong information on them, you have time to try to request a new ballot, right? So I think if you're going to vote by mail, the good news is in 44 states, you can vote by mail for any reason. So it's actually really easy to vote by mail in most states. But there's going to be hiccups with the process, and the earlier you do it, the easier it is to fix. That said, a lot of people are still going to vote the traditional way, which is voting in person. That's also a backstop if there's a problem with mail voting. If you don't get your ballot, for example, or there's an issue with your mail ballot, you can still take your ballot and go vote in person. And so it's important to know also, 40 states have early voting. So you can vote early in most states. It's a lot easier to social distance at the polls if you decide to vote early when there's shorter lines and everyone deciding to show up on November 3rd, when we're almost certainly going to see very long lines and some major problems at the polls in some states. Other things people can do, we desperately need more poll workers right now. The majority of poll workers are over the age of 60 and high risk, so we need a lot of young people to volunteer as poll workers. Go to powerthepolls.org and you can sign up to be a poll worker. Everyone should know about the election protection hotline, which if you have any problems voting, that should be the first place you call, which is 866-OUR-VOTE. It's run by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. People should know that states are going to start ending voter registration really, really soon. October 5th is the last day to register in Florida, in Georgia, in Ohio, in Texas. I don't think people are aware of this at all, that in 5 days, you're not going to be able to register to vote in all of these key states, which is insane, but that's just a reality we're dealing with. And voter registration is way down because of the pandemic, because there's not large in-person registration drives and people aren't also going to the DMV where they tend to register to vote. So basically, everyone just needs to do this as early as possible. If people make a plan to vote and are determined to do it, I think we'll be fine. And this is a really different election than 2016, Katrina, because I think in 2016, there was a lot of questions about, will people vote at all? Are they motivated to vote? In 2020, it's a different question. I think people are motivated to vote. The question now is, will you have your vote counted? And I think that's why people have to be as proactive as possible and take whatever actions they feel like they can take it as an individual to try to make this process smoother. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of questions, so I'm not going to talk any longer, but open it up for questions. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Ari. That was just extraordinarily helpful, just those numbers and organizations you ticked off. People don't know. October 5, you mentioned key states like Florida, voter registration ends. You mentioned, did you say Pennsylvania as well?
Pennsylvania, I think is a little bit later, but I tweeted out the list yesterday, and I can pull it up later and put it in the chat. But basically, there's about 12 states that are going to end registration October 5th. Wow. And some of them are really important swing states. I know off the top of my head, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, South Carolina, where there's a competitive Senate race. Yeah. And so, because states can't cut off registration 30 days before an election, but after that, they can do it whenever. So in a very short period of time, people are not going to be able to register anymore, except in states, there's about 17 states that have election day registration. So like in Wisconsin, if you decide to vote in person, you can show up and register at the polls, which is awesome, which every state should have. But a lot of states don't have that. And so people really need to be aware of this. And I mean, personally, for me, I'm trying to just give people as much accurate information about voting as possible. I am not trying to chase Trump down the rabbit hole and spend every day trying to fact check all of the insane things he's doing. I think the best way to counter Trump is to give people accurate information about voting and make them feel empowered that their vote is going to count, because Trump knows he's losing. That's why he's attacking voting every day, because he knows he's losing and he wants people to feel demoralized, like their vote is going to count. And so the fact that he's saying every day that the election is going to be rigged is an acknowledgement that he's afraid of people voting and that your vote actually does matter. So if you had any questions about whether your vote matters, clearly Donald Trump and the Republican Party are terrified of people voting in record numbers against them.
So quick question, Ari, you mentioned 2001. So let's say Joe Biden wins, a Democratic administration, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House. What could be done, considering the court has gutted key sections of the Voting Rights Act, but what could be done? Because when you think of 2000, you think of Florida, and some people, Bush v. Gore seems like ancient history. It was a coup in some ways. You had Katherine Harris, Secretary of State, running the Bush campaign. You had the Bush's brother, the governor of the state, 500, and the court just cut off counting. What could be done to restore voting in always contested act to a more protected status?
That's a really good question. And I think that's going to be a top priority of Democrats if they take over, is to expand democracy in response to all of the attacks on democracy. I mean, the first thing the Democratic House did when they took over in 2019 was pass a bill called H.R. 1, the For the People Act, that dramatically expanded voting rights. That would do things like nationwide automatic registration, 2 weeks of early voting in every state, allowing people with past felony convictions to vote, cracking down on money in politics, doing independent redistricting. I mean, pretty much every policy proposal that people like me have been talking about that would be good for voting was in that bill. And I think it was really significant. It was the first bill they passed because they recognized if our democracy is rigged, our politics is going to be rigged as a result. So Mitch McConnell has been blocking that legislation for over a year. The House passed legislation to restore the Voting Rights Act in December. John Lewis was presiding over the House when it passed so that states with a history of discrimination can once again have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. That's been blocked by Mitch McConnell. So, I mean, basically all the good stuff the House has passed has been blocked by Mitch McConnell. And if Democrats take over the Senate, and then probably they need to get rid of the filibuster, they can pass all of these things. And I think that wouldn't just be good for Democrats, it would be good for small d democracy. There is a concern about what a 6-3 court would say about all of this. And of course, I think that's one reason why they want Amy Coney Barrett on there so badly, because I think they know there's a good chance Donald Trump loses. There's a good chance they know Mitch McConnell loses, and they want the court to try to nullify everything the Democrats have done. I will say that I do think that all of Trump's comments about the Supreme Court deciding the election, it sets a very scary precedent. I also think it's going to make it harder for the justices to actually do that. So like in Florida, it was more of a silent coup, right? I mean, people were not aware of the possibility of the Supreme Court deciding the election. Maybe they were aware at some point during the recount, but it wasn't like a month before the election we're saying, you know what's going to happen? It's going to be 537 votes in Florida and the Supreme Court's going to stop the counting and declare George W. Bush the winner. But everyone's aware of that possibility now. And so I think I'm not putting anything past this court. This is the court, as you mentioned, that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that upheld the Muslim ban, that has done all sorts of terrible things. But I think this would be way, way, way worse than Bush v. Gore, given what's happening. And I think it would be the biggest constitutional crisis in this country's history if the Supreme Court were to once again decide the election, this time in favor of Trump.
Thank you, Ari. I'm going to turn it over to Erin to take the many questions coming in.
Great. Thanks, Katrina. And we have lots of questions from our audience. Ann Martin is volunteering to observe the ballot handling in King County, and I believe she's in Washington State. Hi, Ann, and thank you for volunteering. We appreciate it. She says, I can assure people that there isn't systemic fraud with mail-in ballots, which is statewide in Washington. One of my greatest fears is Trump's denigration of that process. How can we counter his arguments? Do you think his words will cause long-term harm to our voting system?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, because, I mean, he's already saying all sorts of insane and untrue things about mail voting. And what I always respond with is, first off, mail voting is an incredibly safe way to vote. It's not subject to major voter fraud. There's only been 143 cases of mail ballot fraud over the last 20 years, which is 0.0006% of total cases. It's not a new thing. The military has voted by mail for decades. Overseas voters have voted by mail for decades. States like Oregon have been running all mail elections since the 1990s, and it works incredibly well there. People like it. And it's not a Democratic thing. Utah votes all by mail. Utah has a Republican governor, 2 Republican senators, a Republican state legislature. So if vote by mail is some Democratic plot to steal elections, how is it working so well and so popular in all red Utah, which is controlled by Republicans? And by the way, having covered voting rights for so long, Republicans were the one who were pushing for vote by mail in places like Arizona and Florida, because their voters are older and more rural. And so they don't want to go to the polls in the same way. And so it's only recently when the Republicans and Trump in particular, because I don't think a lot of Republicans are on board with this, it's only when Democrats started taking COVID more seriously than Republicans and voting by mail in larger numbers, that Trump started attacking vote by mail. So Trump isn't opposed to vote by mail. I mean, he himself is voting by mail. I mean, he's just opposed to Democrats voting by mail. And in the same way, when Democrats start voting in person, they're going to be opposed to voting in person. We just saw him saying that they need to watch the polls in Philadelphia. So, I mean, I just think we need to give people facts about voting and tell them that this is not a partisan thing. This is something that's worked well for both parties. It's very convenient. The issues with mail voting is that states aren't prepared for it. And there's a lot of rules with mail voting that don't apply to in-person voting. There's things like in Wisconsin, North Carolina, you have to have a witness signature on your ballot. If you don't sign your ballot clearly, it can be thrown out. You might not get a mail ballot because of problems with the post office or problems with election administration. It might take longer to count those ballots. So those are all the real issues about mail voting that we need to be digging into, not all the crazy stuff Trump is saying about it that's just totally untrue.
We have a couple of process questions that are probably important to because we really do need to know the facts of how this process works. So Jordan Weltman is wondering, he says, which of Wisconsin, Michigan, and PA allow actions toward counting mail-in ballots prior to the election? And along with that, a process idea from Michael Malampy. He says, please explain the process of vote certification after the votes have been counted at the state level.
Yeah, so everyone should check this because there's so many rules about mail voting that even I myself don't always understand every single state's intricacies of how they count the ballots. My understanding is that at least in Wisconsin and Michigan, you have the opportunity to fix your ballot if there's a mistake on it before Election Day. I don't think in Pennsylvania you do have that possibility. So again, people really need to, when they vote by mail, to check this stuff carefully. And if they're confused about the process and they feel safe doing so, they should vote in person. Because if you vote in person, there's someone to help you. That's what poll workers are for. In vote by mail, you don't have that same thing. But that said, if you request your ballot early, there's no reason that you can't take time with it and understand the rules and call your local board of elections if you're confused about how the process works. So I think, again, it just gets back to if people decide to vote by mail early enough, there's enough time both to solve the issues with it, but also to not make those mistakes in the first place. In terms of how it's certified, again, it varies state by state, but it's done at the local level. So, I mean, when President Trump says, I'm not going to accept their election results, he doesn't determine the election results. And I think that's a really important thing that people don't understand. Trump is not in charge of counting ballots. Trump can challenge how ballots are counted. He can file litigation, but that is done at a state and local level. That is done by local board of elections. That is done in conjunction with who the Secretary of State is. Mm-hmm. Sometimes state legislatures have a role to play in this, but it's all done at the state and local level. And I think, one thing I've noticed is that there's actually a lot more bipartisan agreement among secretaries of state than there is at the national level. So a lot of Republican secretaries of state, I don't want to say that they're doing everything they can to help people vote, because they're not. But they don't also particularly think everything Trump is saying is helpful. And they don't really want chaotic elections on their watch. And we saw what happened in Georgia in the primary. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. Both Republicans and Democrats don't want that to happen again at the local level. I'm not talking about Trump. I'm talking about the local level. And so I think that things are going to go smoother than people think in terms of officials trying to get the process right. What I worry about is all the attempts by Trump and the Republican Party to throw out as many ballots as possible. And again, that's just why people should make a plan to vote as early as possible. And if you're confused about the process, try to vote early in person if you can, and you feel safe doing so.
We have a follow-up from Jordan Weltman. He is wondering, what are some of the key litigation going on in states? And is there any chance of any of that litigation reaching the Supreme Court before the election?
There's a very good chance of it reaching the Supreme Court before the election because the Republicans are already appealing all of these decisions. So there's actually been a number of good decisions recently in the courts. For example, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, in all three states, if your ballot is postmarked by Election Day, or in the case of Michigan, the day before, your ballot can arrive after Election Day. Mm-hmm. Meaning if you're concerned about things like post office delays, you now have more time for your ballot to be counted. And that's one of the main reasons why ballots are thrown out. It's because they arrive too late. And so this can really help mitigate that. But of course, the Republican Party and Trump are appealing all of these rulings to the Supreme Court in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania and Michigan. I will say there was just a decision in Wisconsin by 3 GOP-appointed judges who are very, very conservative judges. And they upheld a ruling that gave people more time to vote. So actually, both Republicans and Democrats in the courts are making rulings, making it easier for people to vote. I would be surprised, although not shocked, if the Supreme Court overruled all of these decisions. But again, I'm not going to predict what the court has done because they've done a number of terrible things on voting rights. So I don't want to say that I'm super confident about it. But I will just say there's a long record in the lower courts of making voting easier, particularly because of the pandemic and giving people more time, knowing this is an unprecedented situation we're in.
Marcia Zvankin is wondering if you think that the Biden campaign and Democrats are ready to deal with Trump's attempt to steal the election. Do they have any plans in place?
Well, I will say they've been very aggressive in filing litigation, much, much, much more aggressive than in 2016. They have a much bigger voter protection effort than in 2016. Many more people are aware of these efforts now. You have national figures like Stacey Abrams that are embedding voter protection teams with all of the state Democratic parties. So like in Wisconsin during the primaries, they did a phenomenal job helping people vote and helping people cast absentee ballots. And when I talked to Ben Wickler, the Democratic Party chair there, he basically said that what they're trying to do is, they went from trying to convince people to vote to helping people vote. And I think that's the difference this year. There's less focus on persuasion and more focus on getting your own voters to have their ballots count. So I think this is the Democratic Party is a lot more organized than they were before, but they don't control all the levers of power. They don't control the Supreme Court. They don't control the presidency. They don't control the Senate. And they don't control many, if not all, of the key swing states in terms of the state legislature. So there's a lot of opportunity for Republicans to screw around here. And the closer the election is, the better the chances are that they screw around with it. If it's an overwhelming election, if Joe Biden wins Arizona and North Carolina and Florida and maybe Ohio and maybe Iowa, it's going to be very, very difficult to overturn the will of the voters. If it's 270 electoral votes that he wins and it's within 500 votes in Pennsylvania, I would start getting a little bit nervous in that situation.
So our audience is clearly aware of how many ways the Republicans have to mess with this election, and we have lots of questions about that and how we stop them. So Robert Liebman is asking, how much does disqualification of mail-in ballots for missing information or a mismatch put the outcome in play, and have Democratic lawyers been successful in pushing for ways to cure or correct ballots?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And that's one of the things that we're dealing with now. We saw a huge number of ballots rejected during the primaries because they either arrived too late or people didn't understand the rules or couldn't comply with them. So ballots arrived too late, or people didn't have a witness signature in states that need it, or people didn't sign their ballots clearly enough, or election officials didn't think the signature was clear enough, or people didn't sign the ballots at all, or people put it in the wrong envelope. I mean, there's so many rules with mail voting that, again, I am just encouraging people, if you're overwhelmed by mail voting, you have the option to still vote in person. And what public health experts say is that voting in person is pretty much akin to going to the supermarket. There is some risk associated with it, but it's a relatively low risk for most people. So I just want people to know about that, because I think people have gone so overboard with vote by mail, they've completely forgotten that there's still a whole nother option that, in my opinion, is much more likely to have your vote counted. So I'm not telling people how to vote, but I'm just saying, if you have all these concerns about mail voting, know that there are still options in every single state for you to vote a different kind of way. This is a thing we're seeing in North Carolina right now, because North Carolina, over hundreds of thousands of people have already voted by mail. And there was a fairly high rate of rejection initially. Something like 4% of ballots were rejected, which is enough to swing a close election. But over time, there's a process to fix those ballots, and the rejection rate has gone down to about 1%. So 1% is enough to swing a close election if many more Democrats are voting by mail and many more Democrats are having their votes invalidated. But we're also seeing that over time, those numbers are going down. And so I just think it's so important to understand the rules ahead of time. And I just keep making this point because I just can't emphasize it enough that the earlier you do this, the better chance you have to fix whatever problems you have. It's going to be very hard to fix problems with mail ballots 3 days before the election. I just want to be honest with people. It's a lot easier to fix them 34 days before the election. So if you're going to vote by mail, you absolutely need to request your ballot now. Do not wait a week before the election, because it's going to be very, very difficult, both for it to arrive in time, but also to have it counted. What election officials are saying, what the post office is saying, is request your ballots 2 weeks before the election, mail it back within a week before. I would say do it as early as possible, because there's really no harm if your mind is made up. And then understand that a lot of states have a lengthy early voting period. New York, for example, has 2 weeks of early voting. Michigan right now, you can request a mail ballot and vote at the same time, in person at the polls. So essentially you're doing mail voting at the polls. Wisconsin's going to have 2 weeks of early voting. Pennsylvania has early voting for the first time. Same kind of thing as Michigan. You can request a mail ballot and vote at the polls. Texas, a state where it's very hard to vote by mail, they're going to have 3 weeks of early voting. And so in almost every key state that's going to decide the presidency, it'll be A, easy to vote in person, meaning easy to get an absentee ballot, but B, there's going to be options to vote early in almost all, if not all of those states. And that's something that people should know about.
There's some concern over rights and options when you vote in person, knowing that there can certainly be problems at the polls. Anita Keston is asking, she's looking for advice to give voters when she's making get out the vote calls. If a person goes to the polls and is told they're not allowed to vote, they know they are entitled, what should they do at the polls? Is there on-site help, or do they need to call? And I'd like to add on to that with another question from Bill Durr. He's wondering if there's a long line to vote at the polls. Do laws require that the polling place stay open until everybody in the line has been able to vote?
Yes, that's a really good question. If you're online to vote when the polls close, you have a right to vote. And that's very important for people to understand. There's going to be long lines at the polls. There's going to be long lines at the polls because in some states we don't have enough poll workers, in some states we don't have enough polling sites, but also because people need to social distance. And so what could seem like a relatively short line is going to be longer because people are 6 feet apart. And that's just why I think it's so important to vote early if you have the option, because you're flattening the curve for early voting, right? The more people that vote over more days, the shorter the lines are going to be on election day. So, for example, when Virginia has 45 days of early voting, the first 2 days of early voting, there were pretty long lines. There's no line now. There's no long line on the 38th day of early voting. And so, I mean, if you can, try to vote at off times, try to vote Tuesday morning, try to vote, Wednesday mid-afternoon. I understand people have busy schedules. I understand people are working. We're only doing this once, okay? We're only having one November election. So just try to carve out 2 hours, wear a mask, bring your kids. I have 2 and 5-year-old, bring some fruit snacks. And just prepare them for this process. And this is going to be a different election. Voting is not going to be as convenient this election as it's been in past elections, and we just have to remember this. But we only have to do it once. We can do it once. If we get it right, then we can make a whole lot of changes to our election laws so that the next election it's a lot easier to vote. And the other thing I will say is that Trump administration is clearly going to try to put people at the polls to try to intimidate people from voting. And I would just say, you have a legal right to vote. If you see that kind of thing, you should call 866-OUR-VOTE. You should let your local election officials know about this. Trump is saying he's going to recruit an army of poll workers. Poll watchers have to be signed up with their polling place. They can't just have random people, vigilantes out there harassing people at the polls. That is illegal. So people should know that if they see that kind of harassment, they should call the election protection hotline or contact their local election officials and tell them what's going on, because that is absolutely illegal behavior.
You mentioned part of the benefit of voting early is not only getting your ballot in, but it's knowing if something goes wrong. So what's that feedback loop for people where they find out if their vote has been counted and accepted?
That's a good question. it varies in different states. I know when I vote in person in New York, for example, I put my ballot in and it says ballot accepted and everything's okay. And if there's a mistake, it spits it back out. So, I mean, usually right away. If, for example, there's some issue, maybe you're not registered or they don't have your registration and you have to cast a provisional ballot, then you might not know right away if it's counted. It's also important to know that in many states, like in North Carolina, if you request a vote by mail, you can track your ballot. And so you can track when you requested it, you can track when it was received, and you can track if it's counted. This is how it works in states like Oregon. The process isn't going quite as smoothly in states like New York, which quite frankly are just not prepared to handle the level of mail voting that we're going to see right now. And again, that's just why I want to reiterate, if you're worried about problems with the mail, go vote in person, because that's really the only thing you can do. You can try to do everything you can to mitigate it, or you can decide to take maybe quite possibly a little bit more risk from a health perspective, but less of a risk from having your vote count perspective to go vote in person.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Florida. This question is also from Anita. She's wondering if you can comment on Bloomberg's attempt to pay felon fees, but also if you can talk a little bit about Florida's decision to allow people who have served their time to vote rather than be disenfranchised, and then the fight to prevent it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really chaotic situation in Florida. For many, many years, they prevented people with past felony convictions from voting. That prevented 1 in 10 Floridians from voting, including 1 in 5 African Americans. In 2018, that was overturned through a ballot initiative. 64% of Floridians passed a ballot initiative restoring voting rights to people with past felony convictions. That was a huge breakthrough for voting rights and for the criminal justice system. But then the Florida legislature essentially tried to nullify that law by saying that you have to pay off all fines, fees, and restitution to be able to vote, which nobody was thinking about when they passed this initiative. And that part of the law was upheld by a very conservative court that Donald Trump named 5 justices to. And so what's happening right now is there could be up to 775,000 people in Florida who still owe fines and fees and might not be able to vote. Not only that, Florida doesn't have a centralized database where you can check to see how much money you've owed. So they basically put in place a poll tax, but it's also a literacy test in the sense that you can't actually figure out what's going on. And so it's just an insane example of disenfranchisement. We are running out of time because, as I said, Florida's voter registration ends October 5th. And there's an attempt to try to pay off these fines and fees. It's not just Mike Bloomberg, it's a lot of other people have raised money for a fund to pay off the fines and fees. But we're running out of time. And I mean, I just think it's unfortunate, but tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people, are not going to be able to vote in Florida because of this decision by the courts. And it just once again underscores why the courts are so important. And it's getting so little attention compared to the kind of things Trump's saying. I mean, Trump's saying all of these false things. Trump is raising a stink about 9 disputed ballots in Pennsylvania, where when 775,000 people might not be able to vote in Florida because of a ruling there. That said, even before this felon disenfranchisement law was repealed, there were very close elections in Florida. The 2018 election was decided by 10,000 votes in the Senate, 30,000 votes in the governor. So even though it's discouraging that people are prevented from voting, there still are a ton of people in Florida that are eligible to vote. They need to get out there and exercise their rights.
There have been a few questions in the chat about the red mirage that I think we've all been hearing about, that on election night, more Republicans are going to go to the polls than Democrats, and it's going to appear that Trump wins. And I wonder if you could speak to that dynamic. Jan Ellis said, I heard that Democrats should vote in person on election day instead of early so that Trump has a harder time of declaring victory based on election day voting. And the follow on to that is from Cindy, who says, what do we do if Trump gets reelected?
I saw Move to Canada was trending on Twitter last night.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the state. The Washington Post had a good breakdown of this morning. Some states allow ballots to be processed right when they arrive, right? So if mail ballots arrive early, for example, in North Carolina, they're going to be processed earlier. In some states, they don't process the ballots, both in-person and mail ballots, until later. And then in other states, like in Wisconsin and in Michigan and Pennsylvania, where the deadline for ballots has been extended, meaning that your ballot can arrive if it's postmarked by election day after election day, that just means it's going to take a little bit longer. And so I think we just have to reset all our expectations about this. In some states, we might know a winner on election night, but in other states, we almost certainly won't. It's very, very unlikely that we're going to know the winner in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania because they have given people more time to vote. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that people have more time to vote. And it's far more important to be accurate than to be quick. And I think the media, particularly cable news, has a vital role to play in how they cover this. They really have to walk people through the process to understand that election night is going to be like halftime in many states. It's not going to be the end of the game, and that there's a whole nother half left in terms of counting ballots. And Steve Kornacki and all of these John King, all of these numbers guys, they need to really walk people through it. And they need to have bipartisan secretaries of state on there on election night to understand and after the process. So we need the Republican Secretary of State in Washington or in Kentucky or in Ohio to get on there and to explain to people, and the Democratic Secretary of State in Michigan and California, other places, to explain to people how this process is going to work. Because Trump is absolutely going to try to prematurely declare victory, but he can't actually declare himself the winner of the election. My big pet peeve here is don't give Trump any more power than he actually has. Don't give him powers that he doesn't actually possess. And so I just think we have to walk people through it. They need to understand the process. It's going to take longer this year. We're probably not going to know who the winner of the election is on November 3rd. And that's just the reality, and we all just have to adjust to it.
We have another process question from Carolite. If you requested and received a mail-in ballot, but decide that you want to vote in person, could that create confusion, or is it okay to do?
My understanding is it's okay to do, but you should check with your state or local board of elections. But for example, if you get an absentee ballot and you don't want to use it, you can take your ballot and you can bring it to the polls and you basically exchange your ballots. You give them your mail ballot and then you can vote in person. Alternatively, in many states that vote by mail, you can drop your ballot off. So it's pretty much the same thing as voting in person, except there's not interacting with poll workers. One of the misnomers about mail voting is that it all goes through the mail. Ballots are sent through the mail, but like in Colorado, which is a vote by mail state, 75% of mail ballots are actually dropped off at drop boxes because people don't want to have to worry about their ballot being lost in the mail. They want to actually see it go somewhere. Of course, the Trump administration is trying to challenge drop boxes in Pennsylvania and other states, but I mean, this is a thing that is done everywhere. In New York City, as you guys know, this is what we do. We drop our mail in drop boxes. It's how the mail works in New York if you don't have a house. So this is not like a really radical, controversial thing. So yes, if you don't get your mail ballot, or if you get your mail ballot and you want to vote in person, you absolutely can do so at the polls. Just bring your ballot with you or tell them that your mail ballot was never received.
Thank you. So I think everybody on this call understands that the GOP is trying to suppress votes, right? We're seeing it happening in real time all around us. So knowing that, I mean, where is voter suppression most likely to happen? And I mean, I guess what is keeping you up at night? What is your nightmare scenario? And we've got a lot of motivated people on this call. What do we need to do to try to counter it?
More like what isn't keeping me up at night. I mean, I just think, again, the more people that vote early, both early in person or early in the mail, and the more votes that are counted before November 3rd, the harder it is to screw with your election results and to screw with your individual vote. And the more time you have to fix that problem. So that's the number one thing I would urge people to do. I would urge people to volunteer with election protection, 866-hour vote. I would urge people to volunteer with groups like the League of Women Voters that are very respected, that have done this every election cycle and understand what all the different laws are. I would contact your local board of elections and see what they need help with and where you might pitch in, whether it's being a poll worker, whether it's trying to help people get a witness on their ballot, or whether it's to try to safely social distance and drive people to the polls. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that people could get involved. the thing I worry about is people not understanding the rules, ballots thrown out because of minor errors, the election being very close, and it being litigated so that ballots are thrown out. I'm less concerned with what Trump is saying and more concerned with all the institutional ways they might be able to throw out ballots or subvert the will of the voters. And so, I would just pay very close attention, not really to what Trump is saying, but what your local Secretary of State is saying, what local GOP state legislative leaders might be saying, or in some cases not saying, what local judges are ruling already. I think all of that is going to have a bigger impact on the outcome than what Trump ultimately says, because the president doesn't have the power to certify the results of the election or subvert the vote count unilaterally.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions. We have an anonymous attendee who would like to know what you think of the debate, and they're using the term debate loosely from last night.
I mean, I think we've already kind of been over the debate. So I'm gonna say that I don't have anything to add beyond what Katrina said and try to get to some more election questions.
Okay. Let me grab another one for you. We've mostly talked about the race for the White House, but are there other races for Senate, governor, where you think that the results could be vulnerable to voter suppression?
Well, that's a really good question. I want to point out one really important thing, which is the impact of state legislatures. Mm-hmm. State legislatures are the ones that, first off, write voting laws. So they determine how easy or how hard it is to vote. Secondly, in most states, state legislators draw redistricting maps for the next decade in 2021 after the 2020 census. So the state legislatures that are elected in all of these key states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, they're the ones that are going to draw redistricting maps for the next decade. And that's not getting any attention right now. It's a totally underreported story, the importance of redistricting. Same with the 2020 census. The Trump administration has tried to screw up the census from the very beginning, to try to undercount people of color, to try to undercount immigrant communities, to try to preserve a conservative white power. So $1.5 trillion in funding and the drawing of state and federal voting districts and the apportionment of electoral college votes and House seats all goes to wider and more conservative areas as opposed to more diverse and more progressive areas, even though that's the way that the country is going in terms of the demographics changing and us becoming more of a majority minority country and less of a white male dominated conservative country. And so I would, again, urge people to fill out the 2020 census. If you haven't filled out the census, you need to do it really soon. The census is ending. Any day now it's being litigated in the court, but it's either going to end October 5th or it's either going to end October 30th, but either way, 31st, but either way it's ending before the election. So I would urge people, in addition to all the other things they're doing, to really pay attention to state legislative races, really pay attention to the Senate. If you want to get involved in a campaign, it's a whole lot easier to impact a state legislative race than a presidential race. We're talking about races that could be decided by 10,000 votes, not millions of votes. And who controls those legislatures is going to go a long way to determining the course of our democracy for the next decade.
We have another question from Michael Malampy. He wants to know what happens if Trump launches court challenges to vote totals in multiple states and attempts to drag this process out in appeals past the inauguration date.
I mean, anything is possible. He could try to do that. I think the courts are going to try to resolve this quickly. Again, I can't speak for Justice Kavanaugh or Justice Gorsuch or Justice Roberts or Justice Alito. They're not people that I particularly agree with when it comes to voting rights. And I think I would say the same thing about Justice Barrett if she is confirmed to the court. I do think the Supreme Court's going to want to avoid an outcome where they decide the election. I think they understand how much it tainted the institution after 2000, that it would be a million times worse to do it now with everything as Trump has said. There was, for example, a 7-2 decision from the Supreme Court on Trump's tax returns, saying that the New York DA, that Cy Vance could look into this. So not every decision is 5-4, and not every decision is even 6-3. So I can't speak for the Supreme Court. I think they're going to be very reluctant to resolve this thing unless it's very, very close. And so I think the Trump administration can try, but so far in the lower courts, they have not had a tremendous amount of success in getting ballots thrown out. Both GOP and Democratic appointed justices have been very skeptical of the Trump administration's claims. If people make a mistake and there's a legitimate reason to throw out the ballots, then they might get them thrown out. But if they're just going to say mail ballots should be thrown out because they're mail ballots. That's a completely ridiculous claim that they're going to have no basis to win on.
We're near our time, and I just want to ask one more question before we turn it back to Katrina. We asked about your nightmare scenario. I wonder what is giving you hope. Where do you see really powerful action of movements and people to make a difference in this election? And also, you shared some resources at the start, and I wonder if you could just repeat them again for our community.
Sarah,
Yes.
you had a tweet, right? Did you send out the tweet with Ari's?
So, yeah, let me give you, so the most important resource for everyone to know is 866 Our Vote. You can call them, you can text them, you can go to their website. That is the largest coalition of election protection groups. That is every single group that you could think of is part of that effort. It's nonpartisan, which is what I like. The Democratic Party is going to be doing this too, but I personally think it's better if it's done in a nonpartisan way so it doesn't become a partisan dispute. They're going to have the largest organization they've ever had for election protection. They are trained lawyers. So if you have a problem voting from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, call them. If you want to sign up to be a poll worker, go to powerthepolls.org. I think they've recruited over 400,000 new people to be poll workers, which is awesome. And honestly, something that I think I'd like to see continue in the future so that younger people get involved in the process. What I'm hopeful about is we already are seeing record turnout. We are already seeing hundreds of thousands of people vote. I mean, 10% of people have voted in Wisconsin already, and almost nobody voted early at this time of the year. Many people that are voting did not vote in 2016. So we are seeing record levels of engagement when it comes to voting. From my standpoint, we're seeing record levels of interest in how the voting process works. I think that's partly because people are afraid, but it's also because people want to become empowered. And I think we're seeing people try to become as enlightened citizens as they can and do whatever they can do, big or small, to try to help. And so I think basically the ultimate way to try to defeat voter suppression is unprecedented voter mobilization. We saw that in the 1960s, right? I mean, John Lewis had literacy tests. He had poll taxes. He was brutally beaten. He didn't say, I'm going to stop because of all of these things. He said, I'm going to overcome them. I'm going to build a mass movement to overcome these things. And we can do it again. There's only so much the Republican Party and the Trump administration can do to try to prevent people from voting if people get out in record numbers and exercise their rights. So I would just say everything Trump is doing is to try to demobilize you, try to make it so that you won't vote. That's because he recognizes the power of voting, that if people do vote in record numbers, things can change, and he will no longer be president. And hopefully, January 22nd, I can wake up and I don't have to check the Twitter feed of the next president, and I can sleep in for once.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This was incredible. I think you gave a lot of really valuable information to a really energized community, and really grateful for your time. I'm going to turn it back to Katrina.
Ari, thank you. I want to tell people I'd forgotten this, but John Lewis didn't review many books. And in, was it September 2015, John Lewis wrote of Ari's book, Give Us the Vote, that it was a primer for all citizens. It was must read. And it is the first history he wrote of the contemporary voting rights movement in the United States. It is long overdue, but Berman's extensive reporting makes it well worth the wait. I want to thank you, Ari. I felt this was a little bit of political therapy after last night, because you bring empowering facts, which we all need, and you bring a sobriety to, I think, many people are rightly so anxious about this moment and where we go and the speculation and the scenarios. And I think to say, don't pay attention to Trump, but pay attention to your local Secretary of State. What's happening at the local level is very important. Vote early, vote early, vote early in whatever form. So, very grateful to you for, following the passion you had and becoming this premier voting rights expert we needed. And voting should not be a partisan issue. It's small d democracy, and you really empowered and helped people think through that. So very grateful you joined us. I want to tell people on the call, we have Jamal Bauman next Wednesday. He just defeated Elliot Engel, but more important, he is a really vibrant new addition to the House. And Ari, thank you for speaking about that bill, that legislation, and what could happen if we have
fellow long-suffering Knicks fan.
Is it? And then do look at our site, and you'll get information from us for first nation virtual festival, November 18 to 21. I think we'll need it whatever happens. It will be about hope and what we can do and what we must do. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Ari.
So much, Katrina. Talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.